multitasking.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Farrell. I am the Secretary of the Friends of the Winona Public Library, and we are honored to have our guest this morning, Greg Gaut. Many of you remember him. He was, I want to say welcome back, Greg, to you and Marcia. They lived here in Winona for many years, and Greg taught at St. Mary's University as a history professor. And Greg is very well known in the Minnesota State Historic genre, because he's done so much for our state and for our local community as well. And he is an author, he's an historian and a preservation expert. So he has completed 20 projects that have been placed on the National Historic Register, the last one in 2023 being the Lake Park Band Shell. He has co-written many articles with his wife, Marcia, that have been published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. He is the author of Lawrence Legacy, The History of the Winona Public Library.
This building.
And was the main character in the documentary film by the same name.
Made by Mary.
Yeah, we collaborated on that very well together. Greg's new book, The War at Home, Minnesota During the Great War in 1914 to 1920, was just published. You just had an opening up in Minneapolis, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the book focuses on the lives of individual Minnesotans to tell the dramatic story of this period, when the North Star State experienced bitter polarization, nativism, flagrant disregard for democratic norms, and intense, sometimes violent confrontations. So thank you for joining us, Greg. We are pleased to have you this morning. And I also want to say he will do a Q&A, and his books are for sale at the back table there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mary. So thank you very much to the Winona Public Library, my favorite library, and to Mary, and also to Sam. And I see Leslie, the library director, is here. Thank you very much for that. And also to the Winona County Historical Society for helping with books, back there. I'm really happy to be here because Winona is kind of, Marcia and I's kind of second home. And we lived here for 20 years and we did a lot of things here. And also because this book is the product of about 12 years of work, and so I'm really happy that it's finally happened. I wasn't sure if it ever would happen. It started off as just an article. I was kind of interested in World War I. I was going to write a little article, and then I just couldn't get the article written. It was small enough, and then it kept getting bigger and bigger, and pretty soon I gave up and decided I was writing a book. And I got a lot of help along the way from the Minnesota Historical Society. Most of the research was done at the Library and Archives there in St. Paul, and they also provided me with some research fellowships, which was really helpful. And then they published the book, and that was really helpful too. So I really appreciate their help. Archivists in other places also helped too, like for example in Winona. So Walt Bendick and Andy Bladeover and Anna Gaffey were all helpful, and I really appreciate their help. And I like to say also that many historians in the Twin Cities who I had a chance to talk to helped me a lot, and also a lot of historians who had written in this area before. I mean, I feel like when you write a book like this, it's kind of a collaborative project. You're kind of building on the work of a lot of people who have come before you. So I'm not going to go through all those names, but I urge you, if you happen to pick up the book, to look at the acknowledgments section at the back. And in fact, I think any book you should pick up, you should look at the acknowledgments section, because it's really an important part of the book. How does a book get produced? Who helps? It's not an individual product completely. So I'll just leave it at that. Please take a look at the acknowledgments and see all the people who helped me. And by the way, one of the people who was a big help during this whole 12 years was my wife, Marcia Neff. Sitting right there. Could you raise your hand, please? And she and I are also co-authors of a lot of articles in Minnesota History Magazine. So why this book? So when I was in graduate school, I studied modern European and modern Russian history. And then I taught those subjects at St. Mary's. And in that world of people who study those subjects, modern Europe and modern Russia, no one ever for a moment doubts the significance of World War I. We had this massive carnage, 10 million soldiers and millions more civilians dead, a generation of traumatized veterans, many disabled and horribly disfigured, the collapse of 4 empires, the Russian, the Habsburg, the German, the Ottoman empires, the redrawing of the map of Europe and the Near East, for better or for worse, the weakening even of the victorious nations like Britain, France, and Italy. Mass killing was industrialized and, in a sense, normalized. And then, of course, this all set the stage for the rise of fascism. So, we don't doubt the significance of World War I when we're studying European history. But when I started looking more closely at Minnesota history, reading and exploring Minnesota history, I was surprised that general surveys of Minnesota history kind of pass over World War I as if it was no big deal. And I said to myself, that can't be right. That can't be right. And early on, I read a book by David Kennedy, who's a major American historian. You may know his book about the Depression. It was kind of the standard work on the Depression. Anyway, he wrote a book about the home front during World War I on a national level, which he called Over Here, which I thought was a really kind of clever title to it. And there I read, quote, Americans went to war in 1917 not only against Germans on the field of France, but against each other at home. What happened on the home front, he said, was, quote, a deadly serious contest to determine the consequences of the crisis for the character of American economic, social, and political life. Now, that sounded right to me. So what was he talking about? What did he have in mind? Well, in 1914, when the war broke out in Europe, remember the US didn't enter the war until April 1917, but in 1914, when the war broke out in Europe, the United States was going through this jarring transition to industrial capitalism, dominated by large corporations and trusts. There was this mass migration from Europe going on, and a nativist backlash against it. There was an astounding, at least until the present time, economic inequality, which had begun in the Gilded Age. There was the rise of militant trade unionism, including the Industrial Workers of the World. There was populist farmer organizations that had been going on for a while. There was the rise of the Socialist Party, led by Eugene Debs. There was the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North, and the rise of the NAACP and other organizations to fight Jim Crow, discrimination, and lynching. There was the final push of the women's suffrage movement for voting rights, and then on top of all those things, the movement for prohibition of alcohol production and sale. So would you expect all of these changes and conflicts to just stop dead when the war broke out in Europe, or when the US entered the war in April 1917? No, they didn't stop dead at all. They were all going on, they were all really important. So, I wondered, how did this play out in Minnesota? And it turned out that Minnesota was one of the hot spots, believe it or not, of this war at home, this struggle for the home front. Not only because of all these conflicts which I just mentioned, but also because in Minnesota, going to war at all against Germany was highly controversial. This was true around the Midwest generally, certainly in Wisconsin, but it was highly controversial. So what the deal was, the starting point for all this is that Minnesota was a deeply, deeply polarized and divided society in 1914 or in 1917. So, this is what the book is about. The battles that raged in Minnesota during the war, when the state government was for a time the most repressive in the nation. So how did that happen? How did Minnesota become this sort of storm center during World War I? Well, the first thing we have to keep in mind is that in the Twin Cities, the business community, the business leaders, led by the grain millers, Pillsbury, Washington Crosby, etc., the big banks, the manufacturers, were a highly unified and highly organized group of people. They tended to have a common heritage. They were all what we could call Yankees, that is to say, men of English or Scottish origin. They worshiped in the same churches, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Congregational. They lunched at the Minneapolis Club, they golfed at the Minnetonka Club, they had formed organizations which were committed to keeping unions out of the state, fighting for what they called the open shop. And they were effective and successful. And in fact, they would continue to be effective and successful until 1934 with the famous Teamster truck strike in Minneapolis, which finally opened up Minneapolis to unionization. In March of 1917, when the U.S. was on the verge of declaring war, it looked like the U.S. was going to declare war on Germany, they acted quickly. They went to the legislature, which, by the way, was about to adjourn because at that point we had a biennial legislature. It wasn't going to meet again until 1919. They knew that the Minnesota National Guard, their last defense against strikes, would be federalized and sent to France. They got the legislatures to approve their plan for a Minnesota Commission of Public Safety. And there it is. To govern the state for the duration of the war. So the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety was an unelected body which was composed of the governor, Joseph Burnquist, the attorney general, and 5 men appointed by the governor, who all were, or at least 4 of the 5 of them were conservative businessmen. And one of them, the most important of them all, was a guy named John McGee. John McGee was a lawyer, former judge in Minneapolis, represented the railroads, etc. Extremely conservative, extremely nationalist, sworn enemy of the unions, of the Nonpartisan League, the Socialist Party, etc. And the governor at that time was only 34 years old, and John McGee was in his 50s, and he was a dominant personality. He essentially took over the committee, he became the leader of the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety, which in effect meant that he led the state for the duration of the war. Now, there's a lot in the book about John McGee, but let me just give you one little taste of John McGee's rhetoric. In 1918, he was invited to Washington, D.C. to testify before a Senate committee where some conservative senators had a bill before the Senate to have military courts take over all sedition cases as opposed to just the civilian courts. It was kind of a move towards martial law. And John McGee was all for this. And he went and he testified in a kind of spectacular way. He said to the committee, "Where we made a mistake was not in establishing a firing squad in the first days of the war. We should now get busy and have that firing squad working overtime. These men who are fighting against our soldiers this side of the water and stabbing them in the back are going to die. All socialists should be in internment camps." Well, he said a lot of other things like this. This was actually a public statement in the Senate. It was kind of John McGee's extremely aggressive, conservative, nationalist, reactionary kind of ideology. Well, he became the most important figure on the commission. I should say, though, just to back up a minute, that the business community in the Twin Cities was especially concerned in 1917 to take control of the state because of 3 things that had happened the year before, in 1916. The first was the rise of labor militancy in the Twin Cities. There was a number of strikes in the Twin Cities. But more disturbing to them was what was happening up north. So up in the Iron Range, there was a wildcat strike that the International Workers of the World, the IWW, went up to lead. It didn't last very long, it petered out, but right after that there was a second strike led by the IWW among the lumberjacks and the sawmill workers up north. So this was very concerning, that the IWW, really the most radical of all trade unions, was very busy in Minnesota. Secondly, was this guy. In November 1916, a socialist was elected mayor of Minneapolis. There he is, Tom Van Leer. And this was quite disturbing to the business leaders in the Twin Cities. Partially it was kind of symbolic. Here they were trying to control their own home turf, and a socialist is elected mayor. I mean, how could this be? John McGee said it made him sick when he read the final election results. But the practical part of this was very important too. Minneapolis had kind of a weak mayor system, but the mayor did control the police department. And this was a big concern to the business leaders, because the police, of course, were their first line of defense in strikes. And if a socialist was controlling the police department, that did not sound good. That was a problem. The third thing that happened in 1916, and this was the biggest thing by far, was that a new organization, relatively new organization called the Nonpartisan League, swept to power in North Dakota in November 1916. The Nonpartisan League was an organization of farmers that had decided to give a try taking political power in order to kind of even the playing field between them and the grain millers in Minneapolis by having such things as state-controlled grain elevators, state bank, which of course you may know still exists in North Dakota, state crop insurance, those kind of things to help them in their struggle with the grain millers who dominated the grain industry, which included them, the wheat industry. So after they came to power in North Dakota, they made very clear that next on their agenda was replicating their victory in Minnesota. And they moved their national office to St. Paul shortly after the election in North Dakota. And so they're kind of throwing down the gauntlet, and it was well understood what that meant. So the state was set for conflict, and John McGee made it his business in the first few months of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety to build a set of weapons against the Nonpartisan League, the IWW, the Socialist Party, and the trade union movement. The first was the Home Guard. So remember now, the Minnesota National Guard was gone. There was 3 infantry regiments and 1 artillery regiment. They had all been federalized, and they now were in a camp, actually in North Dakota, in New Mexico, training to become, part of a division that was going to go to France. So they were gone, and so John McGee created what was called the Home Guard, which eventually was 21 battalions around the state. It was essentially a businessman's militia. So small town businessmen, big city businessmen, at least the younger ones, joined the Home Guard, and they were going to be protecting the state from disloyalty, but also, of course, being ready for strike. So here's a picture of them. This is during a strike I'll talk about in just a second. You can see their pistols, their clubs. This is patrolling the streets of St. Paul during a strike I'll mention in just a minute. In addition to the Home Guard, John McGee created what was called the Motor Corps, which is really a part of the Home Guard. It was businessmen who were willing to volunteer to become part of a motor corps brigade and bring their automobile with them. And eventually, there was 10 battalions, over 2,400 businessmen and their cars became part of the motor corps. So this was kind of the mobile force of the Home Guard. Commission for Public Safety also had its own police force. It deputized individuals to be their own police force. It had the cooperation of most, but not all, of the sheriffs around the state. There was 86 counties at that time. Most of the sheriffs were very much on board in helping the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety locally do whatever needed to be done. And there was also many patriotic organizations that allied with the Commission for Public Safety, the Stars and Stripes League, the America First League, the Labor's Loyalty League. It goes on and on and on, all kinds of organizations. And finally, and most bizarrely, was the American Protective League. A bizarre nationwide organization of amateur detectives which offered their services to the federal government, to the Department of Justice, and basically, because this is before the FBI had been created, the federal government did not have a lot of investigative forces. So this organization nationwide offered its services to the Department of Justice, which was accepted by the Attorney General. And they accepted their volunteer services to basically spy on people, to open mail, to arrest people, etc. And eventually there was 250,000 of these vigilantes nationwide, all with the sanction of the federal government. The federal government even gave them these badges. And so, you see it says, American Protective Secret Service, this was the captain's badge. It's an amazing thing, because they had no government, it was not legislated by anybody. It was a volunteer group of volunteers that the federal government accepted as a kind of an auxiliary force. And then they were out in every city doing whatever they wanted to do. And they did a lot, which is covered in the book, but I can't really go into it much now. But anyway, In the Twin Cities, of course, the business community very quickly organized a branch of the American Protective League, and eventually they even had an office in the federal building to run their operations. Well, so with all these forces in place, the story that went on from April 1917 until the end of the war was really a story of conflict along the lines I've been talking about. I just want to mention two of those conflicts, which are kind of the high points, kind of turning points in the story. The first was a strike in St. Paul, well actually in the Twin Cities, against the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company. So at that time, there was this company called the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company that had the monopoly to provide the streetcar service, which was, you may know, is kind of an amazing thing in the Twin Cities. Went all the way from Lake Minnetonka to White Bear Lake. It was a remarkable system, but it was privately owned, and they had a concession from the government, from the city governments. And so, in November 1917, the workers for that company tried to organize a union, and they were rebuffed, of course, and then it led to a strike. And it's a long story, but it kind of peaked with, believe it or not, a general strike in St. Paul. It only lasted for about 3 or 4 hours, at which point the federal government came in to try to mediate the strike, and the unions backed down, which was unfortunate for them because the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company had no intention of paying any attention to the federal mediator, but anyway, they were hopeful that would happen. So this was a failed strike, but it was a really important moment because what happened in this strike was the Nonpartisan League came to support the trade unions in the Twin Cities. And so the trade unions in the Twin Cities, even the more moderate trade union leaders, were kind of radicalized by what happened during the strike for two reasons. One, because they saw that the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety was their enemy, because the Commission for Public Safety did everything they could to break the strike and help the company. But secondly, they saw that they really had a very important ally outside of their own city, outside of the Minneapolis and St. Paul area, and that was the farmers in the Nonpartisan League. And so you had the beginnings of this kind of class alliance, which in a couple years would have a very important result, which is the Farmer Labor Party. This is where it really began during this strike. Okay. Second big event was the June 1918 Republican primary. So the Nonpartisan League, as I mentioned, had decided to move into Minnesota and contest for power. And you know, the Nonpartisan League got its name from its general tactic. The general tactic was to run its candidates in the open primaries of the established parties, which mostly in North Dakota and Minnesota meant the Republican parties, because the Democratic Party was kind of weak then. And so that's what they'd done in North Dakota, and they wanted to do the same thing in Minnesota. So in the spring of 1918, they nominated Charles Lindbergh Sr. to be their candidate for governor to run against Joseph Burnquist in the 1918 June Republican primary. And so, Charles Lindbergh Sr. Now, I want to say very carefully here, notice it says Charles Lindbergh Sr. So there's also a Charles Lindbergh Jr., who you may know, and actually most people know this is Charles Lindbergh Jr. much better than Sr., the famous aviator, but this was his father, Charles Lindbergh Sr. Charles Lindbergh Sr. had served in Congress he was from Little Falls, a lawyer from Little Falls. He served in Congress for that period, from 1907 to 1917. And in Congress, he was known as one of the most radical of the Republican legislators on the populist side. Very much an ally of Robert La Follette, really pushing anything that he could to fight the economic inequality that had happened in the United States after the Gilded Age, especially interested in questions of money and banking. So he was known as the fiercest fighter against what he called the money trust, which is, the Wall Street oligarchy over credit and finance. And in 1916, he decided not to run again, so his term ended in early 1917. And so he was out of office at that time, and so the Nonpartisan League drafted him to be their candidate for governor. He had some name recognition. He was well respected among farmers, well respected among trade unions, at least in the Twin Cities, and he seemed like a good fit in terms of their program. But he had also been very clearly an opponent of going to war against Germany in the period up before 1917 when he was in Congress. And so what happened was the election, on an ideological level, became an election about loyalty. So the Burnquist campaign basically said, we're not campaigning on any issue except one. This election is saving Minnesota from socialism, from the disloyal, from the pro-German. And that's Lindbergh, they said, in the Nonpartisan League. And so that was fought out on that basis. But besides that, the Commission for Public Safety on a state and local level, the sheriffs, the Home Guard did a lot to keep the Nonpartisan League from campaigning. So there was at least 20 counties where they were banned from campaigning at all. It was very difficult to campaign anywhere. They were chased around by the sheriffs, by the Home Guard locally, by vigilantes. It was extremely violent campaign. At the end of the campaign, the Nonpartisan League, one of their signature kind of campaign approaches was to organize car caravans and travel around the county or the region where they were from. And many farmers at that point did have cars, and plus the Nonpartisan League organizers had cars. And so they would build these car caravans of hundreds and hundreds of cars and travel around the state. But when they entered a town, they would almost always lead to some sort of confrontation. Townspeople would rip the Lindbergh signs off their cars, there would be fistfights. It was really, really a good thing that there wasn't too many firearms back in those days, because there was really a lot of violence, mostly fighting, that kind of thing, whenever the Nonpartisan League tried to campaign in a town. It was a really horrendous campaign. Lots in the book about this, but I'll say just leave it at that. Burnquist won, but Lindbergh carried 30 rural counties and got 43% of the vote, which the Nonpartisan League thought was pretty good. He got about 150,000 votes, and there was only 50,000 Nonpartisan League members, so they thought they did well, and especially as a starting point, as a beginning. And from that point of view, I guess it was. But the Burnquist campaign and the Commission for Public Safety had succeeded. Now, I want to try something here. I'm not sure how well this is going to work. There's a little digression into Winona history now. So these are the election results, and probably in the back you can't see this very well, so I'll just have to point some stuff out. About from the June 1917 campaign. So let me just say first, generally, what I found was an incredible, dramatic difference throughout the state between town and rural areas. So in every town, even tiny towns, Burnquist would overwhelmingly have the vote. Could be like 100 to 3 in a small town. But as soon as you went outside the town into the townships, it usually flipped the other way, especially up in western Minnesota and in central Minnesota. And that's why Lindbergh was able to win 30 rural counties. It's quite remarkable. And in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, working class wards voted overwhelmingly for Lindbergh and went the other way in different kind of wards. So for example, in St. Paul's East Side, where the Hams Brewery is, etc., was then, Lindbergh won overwhelmingly. But along Summit Avenue in St. Paul, Burnquist won it overwhelmingly. You can see how the way that works. Now, Winona was not a typical county. For one thing, the Nonpartisan League was not very active in Winona County at all. The Nonpartisan Leagues, they started, their basic base was wheat farmers, and the more diversified agriculture was, the less they really had a base to start with. Plus, they had only been organizing in the state for about a year. So Winona obviously went very much for Burnquist. So you see here, 3,108 to 8, so basically an overwhelming victory for Burnquist in the county. But there's a lot of interesting things you see around here. So for example, if you go to the city of Winona, you'll see that in the wards, maybe I should take this off. No, maybe I won't. In the wards, in the second ward, where wealthier middle-class people would be living, you'd see a big vote for, see like right here, 136 to 26, 165 to 36. That's kind of what you'd expect. So in those middle-class wards, the people who were English and Scottish ancestry, successful business people, voted overwhelmingly against the Nonpartisan League and Lindbergh. But there's even some wards in Winona where it went the other way. Like right here, 123 to 69, it's in the third ward, 2nd precinct. And I think that would be just to the east of the Winona State campus. And I think it might be that that ward had a larger percentage of German American residents, and they tended to lean towards the Nonpartisan League and Lindbergh, even if they weren't members of the Nonpartisan League, because they were so irritated by the way the Minnesota Commissioner of Public Safety and Burnquist had basically castigated Germans as the enemy in some way. But here's one other thing. Look at the east side. 4th ward. Let's see, yeah, 165 to 36, is that right?
Yeah.
Why in the 4th ward does it go the other way, very much for Burnquist?
Those Kashubians hated the Germans.
Yes! I knew Jerome would help us out here. So, ethnically, what we see across the state is German Americans, tended to vote for Lindbergh and the Nonpartisan League, whether they were members or not. And also many Scandinavians, the Swedes, etc. Especially those, obviously, Swedes that were farmers or workers, right? But, and the Irish tended to also not be very thrilled with Burnquist and the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, because, at least for many Irish, going to war as an ally of Britain seemed to be a really, really bad idea until Ireland had independence. But the Poles, as Jerome has pointed out, had a different idea. So at that point, there was no Poland as a state. And so Poland had been divided between the Habsburg, the Russian, and the German empires. And so the Poles felt that World War I finally opened up an opportunity for a free Poland, for the reconstitution of the Polish state. So they were all for the war. So the Kashubians on the east side, where you could see they're voting, they voted very much, they weren't going to vote for Lindbergh, who everyone was telling them was a traitor and a Bolshevik and a pro-German guy, whatever. So no, they wanted that. What they wanted more than anything was Poland to be free. And so you can see what happens there. So anyway, and then of course if we go out in the countryside, you notice there, here's St. Charles City. Look at that, 279 to 12. That's really typical. When it says St. Charles City, that means the actual city of St. Charles. Right below that, St. Charles Town. That refers to the township around the city of St. Charles. And notice the difference, see? You go out in the township, but not closer. But there's even some rural townships in Winona, like Wilson. Look at that. 132 for Lindbergh against 58 for Burnquist. So there's a little bit, you can see a little bit of inroads in the Nonpartisan League in the rural areas in Winona County, but nothing like it was up along the Red River or along the Minnesota River, where you have all these wheat farmers, farm after farm after farm. Anyway, it's a little digression into Winona history. Well, I just want to say now that besides trying to tell this story of what happened during World War I in Minnesota, I was also really interested in just locating the story in terms of individuals. So to see what happened to individuals during this period. And this is something I think we all have in common, which is that we are all born into some social context. We're rich or poor, different ethnicities, whatever. And those things are really important. They limit what's going to happen to us in life, or they give us more opportunities, etc. I mean, that's kind of true of all of us. But if you are suddenly find yourself in a situation of warfare, like imagine if you were, say, a Ukrainian or a Gazan. I mean, your life is completely transformed by what's happening around you, irrespective of what you want to happen at all. It's not that you don't have free will, but that you're constrained by what's happening around you. And so that's definitely true of any sort of war situation, even a war that's going on in another continent. So what I was interested in is how the U.S. declaration of war affected the lives of individuals. And so in the book I try to follow certain people. The main ones are John McGee and Charles Lindbergh. So John McGee, because he was the most powerful man in Minnesota, it seemed like an obvious choice, and one that, you know, a person no one's ever heard of. So I mean, the fact that there's a guy who ran the state pretty much by himself and you don't know about them, I thought was kind of a problem. You should know about him. And the other one is Charles Lindbergh, who was one of Minnesota's most important political figures. And I think a political figure that's especially relevant for us today because he, basically his whole political career was based on fighting economic inequality. But he's largely been forgotten also, his memory eclipsed by the memory of his son, the famous aviator. So for example, if you go up to Little Falls to the Charles Lindbergh House, which is Charles Lindbergh Sr.'s house, you'll find that the Minnesota Historical Society interprets it or presents it as the boyhood home of the aviator. And Charles Lindbergh Jr. did spend some time there, but it's not that much. And so the home is really the home of the father, but he's hardly mentioned when you go to visit there. So one of my agendas was to try to raise the profile of Charles Lindbergh Sr. Now, I just want to very quickly say, there's a couple other people that are mentioned in the book. I'll just mention these really quickly, just to give you a little taste. So I follow a number of characters. Albert Thander was a Minnesota National Guard officer and the city attorney from New Ulm. And there was a famous rally in New Ulm in July of 1917, early in the war, questioning the draft. And for that, the mayor and Thander, the city attorney, the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety used its power to remove them from office, even though they were elected officials. And then he had a lot of other problems along the way. So it was an interesting story to follow. Jens Grandal was the editor of the Red Wing Republican, and kind of the maybe kind of prototypical small town newspaper man. He was all for neutrality before the U.S. entered the war, and after the U.S. entered the war, he became one of the most aggressive, scary kind of boosters of war, militarism, and the suppression of civil rights. Kind of interesting character. Maria Sanford, you might know, kind of a legendary professor from the University of Minnesota, who, like many progressives, started off as an opponent of militarism and then later on became a cheerleader for the war. Alice Ames Winter was a national leader of the women's club movement in the U.S., and she became the chair of the Women's Committee of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. You know, back in those days, all of these groups like the Masons and whatever, they always had to have a women's auxiliary. Well, the Commission for Public Safety had one too, and she led it. Clarence Wigington, famous architect from St. Paul, African-American architect who organized an African-American battalion of the Home Guard as a way to crack open the segregated military in Minnesota. A whole other interesting story. And finally, Sarah Colvin, Minnesota leader of the National Women's Party, an opponent of the war, who was twice arrested at the White House. The National Women's Party took the position that if Wilson thought it was a good idea to go to France to fight for democracy, maybe it would be a better idea to start with democracy at home, like passing the suffrage amendment. And so she got arrested several times for that. My favorite part of the book is the epilogue. It's called Lives After Wartime, where I trace what happened to these people and other people after the war, how it transformed them. There's lots of interesting surprises in there, which I will just leave it at that. Now, I think I have time to read a few. I just want to read two excerpts to give you a flavor of the book, but also what it was like at that time in Minnesota. The first one has to do with something I haven't talked about at all, which besides the Commission for Public Safety, the other part of the repression that went on in Minnesota during the war had to do with court cases. So you probably are aware of the Federal Espionage Act, and so there were federal espionage cases, about 30 of them in Minnesota, where the U.S. District Attorney charged people with sedition, mainly making speeches or saying something to discourage someone from supporting the war. But Minnesota also passed a state sedition statute, which turned out to really be much more important. There's like about 170 prosecutions statewide by local district attorneys under the state sedition statute. So this is kind of the beginning of that story. Out in Jackson County in southern Minnesota. I do, thank you. There he is. So this has to do with a lawyer named James Manahan, who was a lawyer who had kind of dedicated his whole life to representing trade unions and farmers. And so when the Nonpartisan League was organized in Minnesota, he became one of the chief lawyers for the Nonpartisan League. So, here's the excerpt. The first attempt by a county attorney to prosecute a Nonpartisan League speaker was a clumsy one, more of a farce than a crime drama, although it could have degenerated into a lynching. When Jackson County officials got wind of the Nonpartisan League meeting scheduled for January 23rd, so in 1918, in Lakefield, E.H. Nicholas, the county attorney, wrote a letter to the Nonpartisan League promising, quote, to use every measure at our disposal to prevent you from speaking here and to prevent your organization from holding any future meetings in this county. And this was going on all around in various counties. Joseph Gilbert, who was the main organizer for the Nonpartisan League in Minnesota, decided to personally challenge this ban. So he went to Lakefield, and in town, standing on a wagon, he began speaking to a group of farmers. When he said, among other things, that some county officials spelled patriotism starting with the letters P-A-Y, the sheriff arrested him for riot. Several farmers made his bail, and he agreed to return for trial on February 11th. Attorneys James Manahan and H.A. Paddock came south to Lakefield to defend Gilbert at trial. The original charge of riot had been changed to unlawful assembly. Looking back years later, in his memoir, Manahan felt he underestimated how deeply small-town business owners and professionals hated the Nonpartisan League. He thought he had made the prosecution's case look ridiculous. Most pro-Nonpartisan League farmers in the courtroom were gleeful. However, after most of the farmers went home to milk their cows, the judge called an evening session. During an extended dinner break, the prosecution found new witnesses. Near midnight, Manahan moved for an adjournment till the morning. The judge refused, but did allow a man in the audience to auction a parrot. The parrot was named Kaiser Bill. Remember now, Kaiser Wilhelm was the emperor of Germany. And the auction was supposed to be for the benefit of the Red Cross. Manahan saw a trap. If he bought the bird, he would be pro-German. But if he did not, he was anti-Red Cross. He outbid everyone and bought the parrot for $15, and then he jumped on a table to start a new auction, challenging Nicholas to prove his patriotism by bidding, Nicholas the county attorney. In the ensuing uproar, the sheriff rearrested Gilbert. In a fit of anger, Manahan told the hostile townspeople that he would ask the farmers to boycott the town if Gilbert was not released. Farmers bailed Gilbert out a second time, and as the crowd grew more threatening, Manahan, Paddock, and Gilbert attempted a retreat. In his memoir, Manahan wrote that the mob caught him before he could reach the hotel. Someone yelled, "Get a rope!" He sheepishly recounted how he saved himself by telling the crowd that he was, quote, only a lawyer trying a case for a living, unquote, and that he had, quote, no use for those damn socialists. The crowd agreed to let him go if he would drop Gilbert's case and leave town. The next day, Gilbert was convicted and freed pending appeal. Well, this, unlawful assembly thing, the county attorneys down there was 3 of them, decided just to drop this case was no big deal, just a misdemeanor. What they did then, they had a concerted campaign to use the state sedition statute against the Nonpartisan League, against the leaders and organizers. And it was pretty successful, And even after the armistice, Arthur Townley, the head of the Nonpartisan League, and Joseph Gilbert say served considerable time in county jails. This was in 1919, after the war was over, because of these successful prosecutions. Well, the other excerpt I want to read has to do with the University of Minnesota. So we are, I think, yeah, thank you. We are kind of accustomed, I think, to thinking, at least up until the last couple months, of universities and colleges as being places where academic freedom is the most important virtue, and where faculty and students tend to be at least skeptical about militarism and warfare, if not opposed to it. But that was not the case in 1917, 1918. In fact, if you were not enthusiastically in support of the war, you could get very much in trouble. So this has to do with this character, William Shaper, who was the head of the political science department at the University of Minnesota in 1918. So here's the excerpt. John McGee asked Fred Snyder, the chair of the Board of Regents at the University of Minnesota, to investigate several university professors affected with what he called the germ, unquote, of disloyalty. McGee wrote that the commission thought the matter could be safely entrusted to the regents. This decision was not surprising, given that Fred Snyder, was a very prominent lawyer in Minneapolis, was not only the head of the Board of Regents, but also the leader, the county director of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety in Hennepin County. And also, Joseph Burnquist, as governor, served on the Board of Regents ex officio. McGee attached an unsigned statement that claimed all but one member of the German department were disloyal. And in addition, quote, there are two other rabid pro-Germans in official positions, namely Schaefer, head of the political science department, and Alfred Aury, the dean of dentistry. Snyder consulted with Marion Burton, who had just become university president, those dentists, and the stage was set for an inquisition. When summoned before the regents that summer, most of the professors, including all the German language faculty, established their loyalty. On September 13th, the board interrogated the last two, Dean Aker and Shaper. The regents concluded that Aker, a mild-mannered pacifist, was a harmless eccentric, and sent him back to work. Burton then summoned Shaper and informed him that the regents wanted to question him about his loyalty. With no idea why this was happening and no time to prepare, Shaper was ushered into the boardroom. What happened next marks a low point in the university's history. William Shaper was born in La Crosse, son of German immigrants. The University of Minnesota hired him in 1901, shortly after he had completed his doctorate at Columbia University. By 1917, he was chair of the political science department and a respected scholar. Shaper bristled at what he felt were ridiculous insinuations and a humiliating process. He told the regents that although he did not oppose the war effort, he could not, quote, boost for the war, because he had relatives fighting on both sides. When asked what he meant by boosting, he replied that it would be revolting to my conscience to go out and harangue public meetings for the purpose of arousing the war spirit, close quote. This response angered Pierce Butler, a well-known trial lawyer and a regent, who, by the way, was a future Supreme Court justice, who grilled Shaper as Burton sat silently. "You want the Kaiser to dominate the world, don't you?" he demanded. Shaper, just as angry, responded that he thought Butler's question was utterly absurd. To men like Burton, Snyder, and Butler, however, the question was anything but absurd. They had internalized McGee's 100% loyalty ideology that branded a person who was not completely loyal as a traitor. Acquiescence was not enough. Boosting was exactly what they expected of university faculty. After almost 2 hours of tense interchange, the board deliberated and then fired Shaper by unanimous vote. The resolution terminating him said that, quote, the university, the state, and the nation require unqualified loyalty on the part of all teachers at the university, coupled with willingness and ability by precept and example to further the national purpose in the present crisis. The regents made clear they had dismissed Shaper solely for statements he had just made in the boardroom. He probably could have kept his job if he had projected a more obsequious attitude. He was, however, in no mood to cooperate. Schaefer left the university that afternoon unemployed, and he would not find another academic job for 8 years. Well, in the epilogue, Life's After Wartime, there's somewhat of a happy ending to this story, which I'll leave for your own investigation. It wasn't that terrible, but he didn't get another job for 8 years. That was true. So that is the end of my presentation. I'd like to hear any questions or ideas or comments you have. So Sam, yeah.
I have a mic.
Yeah, right.
Can you say something about the reasons that people gave for going to war or not going to war?
That's a big question, Betty. Thank you, though. What became clear to me as I was doing this is that in terms of the pro-war sentiment, there was really kind of two different wings of that are really kind of very separate. So you had that, what I would call the Woodrow Wilson wing, the make the world safe for democracy wing. So that was kind of what today we might call liberal interventionism. So you're going to go to war against Germany, not because there was any great crisis for the U.S. or that we were under any threat, but because the U.S. had some responsibility to take responsibility for democracy in the world. I mean, so that would be the more kind of altruistic, humanitarian part. But then there was a whole other part, the more conservative part, that basically said that was all hogwash, and what was really important was defending U.S. national interests. And this is more, I would say, more the Teddy Roosevelt view, and that it was very important for the U.S. to build up its military strength and to assert itself around the world, to become a major power like the other powers, and that what had happened, by the way, I didn't mention this, but what provoked the U.S. going to war was the German submarine warfare in the Atlantic. And so when a couple of U.S. merchant ships were shot down, they said, well, this is a violation of our rights, and from Teddy Roosevelt's point of view, our manhood is kind of at stake if we don't respond. So these seem to be kind of two really different schools of thought, but they kind of come together. See, I mean, they all were going in the same position, which was basically declaring war on Germany, but kind of from different reasons. They're kind of different points of view. And so, like the Commission for Public Safety, John McGee would be very much in the sort of Teddy Roosevelt camp, but in their propaganda, they also would gave a lot of trying to balance off also the Woodrow Wilson version that we were going to help make the world a better place. Remember now, Woodrow Wilson's idea was, after defeating Germany, his main idea, his big idea was the creation of the League of Nations. So we thought the end of the war would lead to the League of Nations, and the League of Nations would keep further warfare from happening. That was his hope. Teddy Roosevelt thought the League of Nations was a joke, but so there's two really different versions. Now on the other side, so anyway, that's complicated because the pro-war version seems to be there's kind of like two streams of thought. The anti-war point of view was, for example, Charles Lindbergh. People really felt that the business community, basically Wall Street in particular, was manipulating the country and pushing them toward war. So one of the basic issues, one of the big issues was that J.P. Morgan Trust in New York had loaned the Allies, meaning the French and the British, millions and millions of dollars. In fact, James J. Hill in St. Paul had contributed to those loans. And so by the time the U.S. entered the war in April 1917, the British were running out of credit. And of course, they're buying all their food and munitions from the U.S. It's a huge positive thing that's going on in the U.S. economy because of the war, but only to the extent that the British and the French have credit. And so they were running out of credit, and so now what was going to happen? And so from an anti-war point of view, there was a feeling that the U.S. was going to go to war pushed by the armaments industry, the credit industry, the banking industry, etc. They're all who wanted to go to war basically to save their loans and to keep selling more stuff to the British and the French. So that would be one of the fundamental reasons. I mean, obviously, people have lots of reasons for not going to go to war. I mean, there are also people who are just purely pacifists as opposed to having this more political analysis. Anyway, it's a great question, but a big story, right? And so, yeah, thank you, though. Sam, will bring the mic over? Yeah.
I have a two-part question for you. First one is what parallels you might see between Commission of Public Safety and McCarthyism of the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part is what is the significance of those parallels? Thank you.
Well, so what happened during World War I? I mean, in a way, it's kind of surprising. I was surprised, for example. Growing up when I grew up, not in the McCarthy era, I mean, I was just a child then, but afterwards, this whole notion of, what we call red baiting, where, for example, right here in Winona, when I was a student at St. Mary's, I remember going to the city council to apply for a permit to have a peace march to go to Central or Wyndham Park. And we finally got the permit. It was a big fight, but we were basically called communists for doing that. So it's like I was kind of used to this whole notion of red baiting. But I was surprised at, though, in reading the newspapers in 1917, how conservatives were already throwing the word Bolshevik around against anybody they didn't like. And I thought, gosh, the Bolsheviks haven't even taken power yet, and they're already calling everybody a Bolshevik. It's really kind of amazing. I mean, they recognized that Lenin's party, was the most radical party in Russia, etc. But they hadn't even come to power, and it had already become an epithet. Actually, they always said Bolsheviki. They always used the plural. They didn't realize that it was the plural. But anyway, so it's really interesting that kind of Red Square, anti-social square was already very much alive in World War I, and then right after World War I, especially in 1919 and 1920, it was even worse. The Palmer raids, kind of what was officially called the Red Square, etc. So when we get to the McCarthy era, really it's just kind of starting over again. It's kind of a brand new thing. What's I think kind of amazing about the McCarthy era is that in World War I, there was a kind of crisis. I mean, the country was at war. And in the McCarthy era, it's like, what was the problem exactly? I mean, there wasn't really so I mean, and anyway, so it's one of the things that I've noticed about this is that this move away from democratic rights into a more authoritarian thing, which is obviously happening again now. One of the basic tenets of it is to first say, we are in crisis. This is so John McGee said over and over again, essentially, not exactly this language, but the U.S. faces an existential crisis in 1917, and therefore the Commission on Public Safety should be allowed to do whatever it needs to do to control the state, and or even just like move in the direction of martial law. And you're thinking, what exactly is the crisis? I mean, this war is going on like thousands and thousands of miles away across the ocean. But that's kind of the premise, that sort of sets the groundwork. And of course, I think Trump makes a similar argument that the country is in a crisis that has to be restored. We have to take it back. Maybe most of us kind of pass over that part of his rhetoric, but that's an important beginning part. It's always that this is a crisis that we have to act swiftly on to do something about. The McCarthy era, it seems strange to me because it seemed more manufactured, although this is in the context of the early days of the atomic era, and there was lots of fear about that. And you said two parts of your question. I'm not sure.
The significance of those parallels.
Yeah, well, maybe I've talked about that enough. I mean, it's really, yeah. So I give up on that one. Thanks, Tomas.
Greg, thank you. I got a really easy question.
Oh, there you are.
I got a real easy question.
Oh, good.
How big is a burial stone on Mr. McGee's?
How big is it?
How big is it?
I actually went and looked at it. It's a very simple stone. It's just one of those basic stones, and it just says McGee. And I went and looked at it. It's in the Catholic Cemetery in South Minneapolis. And what I meant to go back and check, which I never did, is whether there's other family members buried there or not. I'm not sure, because it just says McGee, it doesn't say, yeah. So, I wasn't gonna say anything about this because I was trying to, not do spoilers here. Yeah, in the epilogue, there's really, I'll just say, there's really interesting stuff about the end of John McGee, I'll just put it that way. And so, okay, he killed himself. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that he, it was very clearly a suicide, and he had become a federal judge by that time. He killed himself in his chambers in the federal building downtown Minneapolis. And a long suicide note, and there's no question it was a suicide. And so there was and he was a well-known Catholic, and there was this huge Catholic funeral at St. Stephen's Church, which ironically at that time was a church of wealthy people. No, it's not. And then he was buried in the Catholic cemetery. Oh, I gave away all this good stuff, but anyway. But yeah, so that's why he's there. It's a really interesting story about what happened to McGee after the war was over.
Do you know why?
Why?
He killed himself? I mean, what happened? Is this more?
Well, so we left a suicide note that's actually pretty explicit. I mean, basically he was having a nervous breakdown. He was kind of an obsessive personality. So what had happened was after the war, he had campaigned to become a federal judge. He became a federal judge. And this was during Prohibition, and he was famous. He would sentence 65 people in a day for Prohibition for violations. And he worked overtime all the time. He even held court on Saturdays, and on Sundays he would go to his chambers to write briefs, etc. And that's where he was on a Sunday morning when he killed himself. He didn't come home for lunch. His daughter went to look for him. He shot himself with a pistol. And he left a note saying that he was just overwhelmed by his work. But he also said that he felt kind of betrayed by the wealthy business leaders in Minneapolis for whom he had sacrificed so much. And once the war was over, it was kind of like, oh, thank you, no problem. So there's lots of stuff in the book about this, but let me just say, John McGee was an unusual person. He was an Irish Catholic, grew up on a farm in Illinois, graduated from high school, and was self-educated after that. Back then you could, just, what they said, read law with a lawyer. He read law with a lawyer, became a lawyer, practiced in North Dakota, then he came to Minneapolis, was very successful, became kind of a corporate lawyer. He was a district court judge for a while, and then he went back into private practice, and he was on the Commission for Public Safety, and he was really dedicated himself to, fighting for the interests of the wealthy. And then, on the Commission for Public Safety, he was basically a volunteer for those almost 2 years. He wasn't a paid position, even though he was running the state. And when the war was over, he went back to private practice. He was kind of bored with it, and then he became a federal judge, and then eventually killed himself. But he basically said, they kind of took me for granted. They didn't feel thanked for all that he had sacrificed for the wealthy. And he was, as I mentioned, the people who ran Minneapolis and St. Paul, or Minneapolis anyway, at the top were Yankees. And none of them were Catholics. None of them were Irish. So he was, when he lunched at the Minneapolis Club, he was kind of a little bit of an outsider, but very well accepted because he was such an effective defender of their interests. But he really wasn't one of them. And I didn't really think of him that way. They were very clannish, They started their own high school. They started for boys, Blake. They started their own high school for girls, etc. I mean, there was a very tiny little, tightly organized little ruling class in Minneapolis. And he served it, but wasn't really in it. Now I've really given away everything. So
Except there's a great Winona story, and do not tell it. And others, okay. I mean, you have it.
Oh. Oh, yeah.
You haven't given Winona stories, but there is a different Winona. Do not.
Okay. My lips are sealed. Are there any other questions? Jerome.
Yeah, definite drift, or not just a drift, but a momentum toward authoritarianism through this period.
Yeah.
And into the 20s with the
Right.
Red Scare. What caused it to reverse itself?
You know, that's a hard one. I think somebody needs to write a book about the 20s too, in a detailed way in Minnesota history. But yeah, no, I mean, so one of the great things about the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, one of the best things about it, was that they recognized that they should shut it down when the war was ended, when the armistice came, which was good. But they went to the legislature and tried to get the legislature to institutionalize the Home Guard and the Motor Corps. I mean, they were trying to save some of these things they created for the long run. But that didn't work, and they weren't able to do it. But yeah, the 1919, 1920 were really tough times, and the 20s were generally. But the other thing that was happening was what I mentioned, you know, in the rapid transit strike. This class alliance between the farmers of the Nonpartisan League and the trade union, especially in the Twin Cities, got stronger and stronger, and the Farmer Labor Party got stronger and stronger. And pretty soon the Farmer Labor Party was electing a lot of people, including at one point both senators, both U.S. senators. And then, starting in 1932, for 4 election cycles, the governor, you know, Floyd B. Olson, Elmer Benson, etc. And so that started having a big impact. Republicans still controlled, I think, the Minnesota Senate, but things were really, in terms of what was going on politically in Minnesota, the Farmer Labor Party at least put a brake on, you know, some of the stuff. And then, of course, there was the Depression and the war. I mean, it was like all these things going on. I mean, one of the things that's challenging about writing Minnesota history or Winona history, whatever, is starting with the big context. So there's stuff going on in the world, there's the war, and then stuff going on in Washington. Then how does that all play out in Minnesota? And then how does it all play out in a small town? It's really some of these concentric circles that you try to figure out. And so when you say, well, why did things change in Minnesota? Well, particular things were happening in Minnesota, but also things were happening nationwide too. So it's complicated. I always used to tell my students the problem with history is it's even more complicated than you think. I never wanted to hear that, but it's true. So, Tomas, one more question?
One more question. To your knowledge, have there been any efforts by the supporters of MCPS to revive the organization during World War II?
You know, that's a good question, but I'm not sure. There was similar things that went on during World War II, but you know that the political context and the ethnic context and everything in World War II was so much different that I don't think it played out in the same way. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Real quick, as a reminder, the book is for sale at the back by the Winona County Historical Society.